Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, cut through the noise, and really try to unearth the most important nuggets of knowledge for you.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're embarking on a journey into, well, a topic that, for most of us, I think, resides firmly in the realm of unsettling fiction. Cannibalism.
Right. A heavy one.
Yeah, but we're not talking about, sensationalized horror tropes here.
Yeah.
We're actually looking at historical reality, something often shrouded in mystery and, let's face it, profound taboos.
Absolutely. But it holds surprising nuances, doesn't it? Things that can challenge what you thought you knew about human history, human behavior.
Exactly. And for this exploration, we've gathered, well, quite a lot of material. Groundbreaking archaeological studies, critical analyses of ancient chronicles.
Our goal really is to peel back those layers of sensationalism, to dive deep into how this practice actually manifested across incredibly different human societies.
We'll be looking at some pretty compelling evidence that suggests it was a routine, culturally ingrained practice in one distant era.
And then we'll shift our gaze completely, thousands of years later, to another time where accusations of cannibalism seem much more tied to extreme desperation, survival, or maybe even external propaganda.
So our mission today is clear. We want to understand the motivations, the actual evidence, archaeological, historical, and importantly, the biases that shape how we even think about cannibalism across cultures.
Right. It's not about morbid curiosity. It's about giving you, the listener, a truly well-informed, multi-layered perspective on something most people just glance at superficially.
Okay, so if you're ready, let's unpack this fascinating and, yeah, at times pretty unsettling corner of human history.
Let's do it.
All right, so we begin our journey by traveling way, way back, not just centuries, millennia. We're talking about 15,000 years ago, roughly.
To the Magdalenian period.
The Magdalenian. Okay, so this falls within the late Upper Paleolithic era, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge stretch of time, maybe 11,000 to 17,000 years ago.
That's the ballpark, yes. And when we talk about the Magdalenian culture, their most famous sites where a lot of the early work was done are in France.
Okay. But their cultural footprint, it wasn't just confined there. It actually spread across a really wide swath of Europe. Places we now know as Germany, Spain, the UK, Belgium, Poland, Czech Republic, even Portugal. Wow, so this wasn't some small, isolated group. They were widespread hunter-gatherers adapting to that challenging post-Ice Age world.
Exactly. Adept survivors. And their extensive reach is what makes this new study, published in quaternary science reviews, so incredibly significant.
Ah, the new research. What's the headline finding?
Well, it's what many in the archaeological community are calling truly groundbreaking. It really challenges our sort of default assumptions about prehistoric behavior.
How so? Because when I hear prehistoric cannibalism, honestly, my mind jumps straight to, like, worst-case scenarios, starvation, right?
That's the immediate thought, isn't it? Dire straits, last resort, people driven by extreme hunger to consume human flesh just to survive. That's the common narrative.
Totally. The Donner Party, the Andes crash. You assume it's a complete breakdown of norms, the final unthinkable thing.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that is exactly why this study is such a revelation. It indicates that for these Magdalenian people, cannibalism was not an anomaly. It wasn't a famine food.
So what was it then?
It seems to have been something far more ingrained. A routine funerary practice.
Wait, routine, as in normal, part of their culture.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests. An integral part of their culture, a deliberate choice in how they handled their dead, not just an act of necessity for food.
Okay, that's a huge shift. Not we're starving, but this is how we deal with death.
It's a fundamental difference. It overturns a lot of earlier assumptions and forces us to, well, redefine how we view these ancient societies.
Wow. Okay, when you first encountered this idea, this hypothesis, I mean, what was your gut reaction? And how on earth do archaeologists even prove something like that from bones that old? It seems incredibly specific and, frankly, counterintuitive.
Oh, it definitely gives you pause when you first hear it. It makes you question assumptions you didn't even know you had, you know? The initial reaction is often skepticism because the default explanation for any kind of bone modification in prehistory is often, animal scavenging, maybe starvation, weathering.
Right, the simpler explanations first.
But the archaeological evidence here is incredibly compelling. And it's compelling precisely because the researchers weren't just finding isolated incidents or ambiguous marks. They were looking for very specific, very consistent patterns across multiple sites.
So it's more than just that famous site, Goss Cave in England. I remember hearing about that, the skull cups and chewed bones.
Exactly. Goff's Cave was fascinating, definitely hinted at this. Those modified skull cups, the nod bones. But for a long time, it was hard to say, was this unique to Goths, a very localized ritual, or maybe, like you said, just one instance of survival.
Okay.
But this new study, led by experts at London's Natural History Museum, basically makes it clear that Goth's Cave was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much broader pattern, potentially across the continent.
How did they establish that?
They did a massive review of existing literature, meticulously went through records for 59 Magdalenian sites across Europe where human remains have been found.
59 sites.
And from those, they felt they could interpret the funerary behaviors at 25 of them with enough certainty. That's a pretty solid data set covering a wide geographical and time range within the Magdalenian period.
25 sites with enough evidence to interpret.
Yeah.
All right. So what were the actual signs on the bones? What makes them say cannibalism and not, say, animal attack or some other process? Distinguishing that must be incredibly precise.
It is. It requires years of forensic archaeological expertise. They found very distinct patterns, not just random damage. And at 15 of these sites, the signs were clear, unambiguous indicators of cannibalism.
15 sites. Okay, like what specifically?
Well, first, human remains with chewing marks, and crucially, marks consistent with human teeth. They can differentiate these from animal gnawing based on the size, the shape, the pattern. Animal teeth leave very specific scores and pits. Human teeth leave different marks, even if subtle.
Okay, chewing marks. What else?
Beyond chewing, skull bones with distinct cut marks. Again, forensic archaeologists have refined methods to analyze these. They look at the depth, the direction, the microscopic patterns left by stone tools.
Stone tools, right.
And these cuts are consistent with defleshing, carefully removing flesh from the bone, much like you'd butcher an animal carcass to prepare it. These aren't random scratches or impact marks from violence. They're deliberate, pattern marks suggesting systematic processing.
So, dismembering with intent. What about the other bones, like arm or leg bones?
That's perhaps the most revealing part. Many bones were purposefully broken in a very specific pattern, a pattern associated with extracting bone marrow.
For the nutrients, the fat.
Exactly. Marrow is incredibly calorie-rich, and this wasn't just random smashing. When you want marrow, you tend to break long bones in particular ways to access the cavity inside. Seeing this systematic breakage pattern is a very strong indicator of nutritional intent, suggesting consumption. Think about cracking a lobster claw or something similar. It's a specific technique. They were doing that, but with human bones.
Wow. That level of detail, processing bodies like game animals, that's chillingly specific. Did anything else suggest it was more than just about getting calories? You mentioned earlier it might be ritualistic.
Yes, another layer. The researchers also found evidence suggesting that sometimes human remains were actually mixed in with animal remains, in the same archaeological contexts like refuse pits or maybe ritual deposits.
Human and animal bones jumbled together.
Right. This blending suggests the human remains were being treated in a very similar way to their hunted game, which points more towards a specific, deliberate cultural process rather than just, scavenging during a famine. It wasn't hiding it. It was part of the process.
So the interpretation of intent is really the key here.
Absolutely. The ritualistic manipulation, the careful defleshing, the marrow extraction, modifying skulls combined with how frequently it occurred across Northern and Western Europe strongly suggests this was, in fact, a widespread burial practice.
A primary method for disposing of the dead.
That's the interpretation, rather than just supplementing their diet. Sylvia Bello, a paleoanthropologist at the Natural History Museum and co-author, put it very starkly. She said, instead of burying their dead, these people were eating them.
Instead of burying their dead, these people were eating them. Wow. That quote really hits home. It completely reframes their funerary rites. It wasn't desperation, it was culture.
It seems so. A deeply ingrained cultural act.
And the historical significance of this finding, it must be huge in the field, right? Pushing back the timeline for this kind of behavior.
Oh, it's monumental. This represents the oldest and most widespread evidence of cannibalism as a routine funerary practice known to date. Period.
The oldest known.
Yes. So it's a pivotal discovery for understanding ancient human behavior, the sheer diversity of cultural practices throughout our history. It forces us to really question our assumptions about what's natural or universal when it comes to treating the dead.
It's a powerful reminder that our modern taboos aren't necessarily everyone's taboos throughout time.
Exactly. Culture shapes everything, even something this fundamental.
Okay, so we have this incredibly strong archaeological picture. But now, especially with ancient populations, genetics often adds another layer. Did they manage to look at the DNA? Could they link this behavior to specific groups?
Ah, yes. And this is where the study gets really interesting, adding another compelling layer. They didn't stop at the bones. They managed to get ancient DNA from bone samples at 8 of these Magdalenian sites.
8 sites with DNA. Okay.
And then they combined that genetic data with archaeological evidence of funerary behavior. What they found was fascinating, a clear link between distinct funerary practices and specific genetic ancestries.
So different groups were doing different things.
Essentially, yes. They identified 2 distinct ancestral groups present in the broader region during this period. One was the Magdalenian culture we've been talking about. The other was a group known as the Epigravettian.
Epigravettian. Okay. Were they related or separate?
A distinct European human culture, genetically speaking, and often found more widely across South Central Europe, geographically somewhat separate initially.
So 2 different genetic lineages, maybe coexisting or interacting over time. And what about their funeral practices? Did the genetics line up with the eating versus burying?
It lined up incredibly clearly. The behavioral differences were striking. People belonging to the Magdalenian genetic cluster in northwestern Europe, the ones whose remains showed all those signs, consistently preferred to eat their dead. That was their funerary practice.
Okay. And the Epigravettian group?
In stark contrast, humans from the Epigravettian culture preferred to bury their dead without any evidence of cannibalism, more like what we'd consider a traditional burial today.
Wow. A clear cultural divide tied to genetic ancestry.
It seems so, and the study then proposes a theory for a shift seen over time. Earlier Magdalenian sites show this cannibalism practice more frequently. Later Magdalenian sites start showing more conventional burials.
So they stopped eating their dead later on. Why?
The study suggests this shift towards regular burial during the Upper Magdalenian wasn't necessarily an internal evolution. Instead, it might be due to the migration of people with Epigravettian-related ancestry into areas previously dominated by Magdalenian-related groups.
Ah, okay. So one population moves in, under their own customs, and gradually replaces or influences the existing population's practices.
Exactly. It's a concept called demic diffusion. William Marsh, another researcher on the study, explained it as essentially one population coming in replacing another, and that brings about a change in behavior.
So the change in Magdalenian funerals wasn't necessarily them changing their minds, but rather new people arriving with different traditions.
That's the hypothesis suggested by the combined genetic and archaeological data. It's a powerful example of how migration can reshape fundamental cultural practices.
That is a really compelling argument, linking genes and behavior like that. But I imagine this is still complex, right? Early days for this kind of analysis on this scale.
Oh, absolutely. The authors themselves are clear. These are preliminary results. More larger scale analysis, more data is needed to fully confirm everything. That's just how science works. You build on strong initial evidence.
Yeah.
But it's worth noting that outside experts are finding it persuasive. Thomas Booth from the Francis Crick Institute wasn't involved in the study but commented on it. He said that while certainty is always tricky with the deep past,
Because the evidence is so fragmented.
right, but he felt this study provides pretty convincing evidence that this kind of ritual funerary cannibalism was practiced across parts of Europe 20,000 to 14,000 years ago, so the scientific community is taking it very seriously.
Pretty convincing evidence. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a truly fascinating and, profoundly unsettling insight into our ancient ancestors. The idea that eating the dead could be common, accepted, maybe even ritualistic. It just completely upends our modern ideas about how humans always treated their dead.
It really does. It's a stark lesson in cultural relativism.
It absolutely is. And that profound cultural difference, how we approach death and the dead, that's actually our transition point, isn't it?
Precisely. We've just explored a time where consuming the deceased seems to have been an ingrained ritual, part of the societal fabric, maybe tied to beliefs about ancestors or community. Now, let's fast forward thousands of years to a completely different context, the Viking Age.
Ah, the Vikings.
Here, the claims of cannibalism are far, far less clear-cut. They get tangled up with desperation, survival, and maybe most significantly, the really potent force of historical propaganda.
So what was a ritual in one era becomes something else entirely. Something much debated, much murkier.
Exactly. It becomes a subject of intense debate, scarce evidence, and often outright fabrication.
The Vikings. Yeah, the word alone brings up images, doesn't it? Fierce warriors, master navigators, traders. They sailed everywhere, raided, settled new lands from Russia to North America, explored places no European had seen before.
Pioneers, explorers, formidable adversaries, no doubt.
But lurking in the shadows of that reputation is this chilling question. bringing us back to our theme, did the Vikings ever actually resort to cannibalism?
Was it desperation? Was it some dark pagan ritual? Or was it just a gruesome story spread by their enemies?
Right. This part is all about tackling that question. Looking at the claims, dissecting the, well, you said sparse evidence, trying to find the truth behind this taboo in their world.
And it's absolutely critical here to approach this with a really skeptical, critical eye, especially with historical accounts from the early medieval period.
Because the sources might be biased.
Hugely biased. Claims of Viking cannibalism are often highly sensationalized, very disturbing. They seem designed to provoke fear and disgust. So we have to understand where these claims come from and who was making them.
Okay, so where do they primarily come from?
Two main sources, really. First, and probably most common, are accounts from foreign chroniclers, particularly Christian monks.
The people they were raiding.
Exactly. These monks were often on the receiving end of brutal Viking raids. Their monasteries plundered, communities terrorized. So, understandably, their writings frequently demonized the pagan Norse. They painted them as monstrous savages, capable of any depravity, completely outside Christian morality.
So figures like Adam of Bremen, maybe? Those medieval chroniclers?
Precisely. Adam of Bremen, later Icelandic sagas recorded by Christian scholars. Occasionally you find these vague, often sensationalized accusations, but you have to remember these weren't objective historical records. They were often closer to moral tracts or propaganda pieces.
Right. Not just mentioning it, but using it to paint the Vikings as fundamentally barbaric, almost inhuman. What about their own stories, though? The Norse sagas, the folklore, does that mention it?
Much, much less so. And when it does, it's far more ambiguous, requiring careful reading. You might find fragmented, very subtle mentions in some sagas or folklore that could hint at desperate acts in isolated situations.
Like during a terrible voyage or a settlement cutoff.
Potentially. Tales might allude to extreme hardship, where individuals faced unthinkable choices. But, crucially, these narratives never explicitly confirm widespread, routine, or ritualistic cannibalism among the Norse. They might describe someone's descent into madness or desperation, but they lack that clear cultural confirmation we saw archaeologically for the Magdalenians.
So hints of desperation maybe, but not acceptance.
Exactly, which is why that critical eye is so important. Propaganda and exaggeration were powerful tools back then, just like now. And we have to ask, does the lack of clear proof mean it never happened? Or does it mean the stories told about them were designed to serve an agenda, not record objective truth?
That's a really key question. When we talk about proof, what does archaeology say about the Viking Age? Can forensic methods find clear evidence on bones that old? And what are they looking for?
Forensic archaeology is our best objective witness, even with challenges like preservation over centuries. When looking for cannibalism signs, archaeologists search for specific indicators, similar to the Magdalenian case, but considering Viking Age tools and practices.
Like metal tools instead of stone.
Right. Clear-cut marks from butchering, possibly made by metal blades typical of the era, marks consistent with dismemberment, defleshing, portioning a body like an animal carcass.
Okay. What else? Burning, marrow.
Yes, signs of burning consistent with cooking, distinguishing that from cremation, which was common, is tricky but possible based on charring patterns. And again, evidence of marrow extraction bones purposefully broken in that specific way to get the nutrients. The key is always distinguishing these signs from other damage. Animal scavenging, burial disturbances, even ritual dismemberment that wasn't for consumption.
So if it happened often or even semi-often, we should find some physical evidence in their burial sites, settlements, battlefields. What does the record show?
And this is the critical point. This is where the evidence for widespread Viking cannibalism really falls apart. While we find plenty of evidence for violence on Viking Age remains, battle wounds, ritual injuries, dismemberment linked to funerals or warfare clear, unambiguous signs of processing for consumption are exceedingly rare, almost non-existent.
Really? Almost non-existent?
Yes, and that rarity is incredibly significant. If cannibalism were widespread or even a common last resort in famines, logic dictates we'd expect to find more compelling, more frequent evidence in graves, settlement trash pits, battle sites where bodies were left. The lack of consistent findings strongly suggests it was absolutely not a prevalent practice.
But, as you said, the archaeological record isn't perfect. The Viking Age covers centuries, huge areas. Scandinavia, Russia, Greenland. We can't say never, right? Gaps exist.
Precisely. That's the crucial caveat. Absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. The Viking Age stretched roughly from the late 8th to mid-11th century. Records are incomplete, Sites are lost, unexcavated, poorly preserved. We're missing countless individuals.
So the evidence argues strongly against it being common or routine.
Overwhelmingly so. But we can't entirely dismiss the possibility of isolated, extreme instances under very specific, desperate conditions. And that's where understanding their daily life, the context, becomes so important.
And that context, especially in some places, was incredibly harsh. They were living on the edge of survival sometimes, weren't they? Facing huge environmental challenges.
Absolutely. Think about Norse life in remote spots like Greenland, or during those incredibly long, dangerous sea voyages. Weeks, months, no resupply. These were pioneers pushing human limits in really unforgiving climates.
So famine must have been a constant worry.
A constant, terrifying threat. Crop failures from bad weather, short growing seasons, unsuccessful hunts or fishing, livestock disease, supply lines cut off by storms, ice, conflict. These weren't abstract risks. They were real dangers that could quickly lead to starvation.
And we know from history, more recent history even, that extreme hunger can push people past unimaginable boundaries, overriding taboos, like the Donner Party or the Andes survivors. Is there a known historical pattern for this kind of desperation?
There absolutely is. It's a grim aspect of human history, but important for understanding our limits. Extreme desperation, especially prolonged starvation in isolated or trapped situations, has driven people to cannibalism across different cultures globally. It really is the ultimate horrifying last resort.
When there's literally nothing else.
Nothing. Death by starvation is the only alternative. We see it with shipwrecked sailors lost for months, early colonial settlements like Jamestown during the starving time, where archaeology actually confirms desperate acts. So this context makes the possibility of Viking cannibalism under such extreme conditions plausible. Unsettling, but plausible, even if it wasn't common or culturally accepted.
What about the Greenland Vikings specifically? They faced terrible conditions towards the end, didn't they? The Little Ice Age, isolation.
They did. They settled Greenland late 10th century, thrived for a while, but then faced that brutal cooling period, the Little Ice Age, plus increasing isolation from Scandinavia. Their diet was precarious marine mammals, limited farming.
And do their skeletons show anything? Malnutrition? Cannibalism?
Their skeletons absolutely show signs of severe malnutrition, scurvy, rickets, general dietary stress. It confirms the immense hardships they faced as their environment failed them. But, and this is critical, the remains do not definitively show signs of cannibalism. The conditions were dire enough, yes, but the specific archaeological proof isn't there. Inconclusive.
Okay, so if it happened, it seems almost certain it would be that extreme survival scenario.
Yeah.
An aberration born of desperation, which brings us back to that crucial distinction. Survival versus ritual cannibalism.
Yes.
We saw clear ritual with the Magdalenians. Was there any hint of ritual cannibalism among Vikings, part of their pagan faith?
Yeah.
Eating enemies for strength, anything like that?
That's a vital distinction, and we shouldn't confuse the two motivations. Survival cannibalism is pure biology, desperation overriding taboo to avoid death. Ritual cannibalism is spiritual, cultural, absorbing strength, honoring ancestors, funerary rites like the Magdalenians.
Man for the Vikings. Any ritual evidence?
When we look at the Vikings, while their paganism definitely involved things like animal sacrifice, blood rituals, or rich cosmology, there is virtually no archaeological or strong textual evidence suggesting ritual human cannibalism was a common or accepted part of their beliefs.
Nothing in the sagas or Eddas about eating enemies or ancestors as part of a ritual.
No. Their literature describes elaborate funerals, burial mounds, ship burials, Valhalla for warriors, but consuming human flesh isn't part of those documented spiritual practices.
So, even though they were fierce warriors, that wasn't part of their code or belief system.
The available evidence doesn't support it. If cannibalism did occur among Vikings, it would almost certainly fall into the category of extreme survival. The psychological and societal taboo against eating human flesh is incredibly deep-rooted, almost universal, including among the Norse. Overcoming it would require the absolute worst circumstances imaginable.
A total breakdown.
Exactly. So any claims of Viking cannibalism, overwhelmingly interpreted as a final, desperate act against starvation, not a sacred practice. Context is everything.
Which leads us to maybe the most powerful distorting factor, the politics of accusation. We touched on Christian monks demonizing pagans. How much were these claims just propaganda, serving an agenda?
Likely, an enormous amount. The spread of Christianity in the Viking Age wasn't usually peaceful persuasion. It was often intense religious and cultural conflict, frequently backed by military force.
A clash of worlds.
Definitely. Christian missionaries and rulers directly opposed pagan faiths like Norse paganism, viewing them as barbaric, demonic. In that fight, Christian chroniclers weren't neutral observers. They were often active propagandists in a cultural war.
So they deliberately painted their enemies in the worst possible light.
Absolutely. Emphasizing barbarism, savagery, supposed abhorrent practices, and accusing someone of cannibalism. That's a powerful tool for demonization. Eating human flesh is such a deep, universal taboo. Accusing your enemy of it instantly strips them of humanity, makes them monstrous, subhuman.
And that must have been incredibly useful for justifying actions against the Vikings, right? Like, we're fighting monsters, so anything goes.
Precisely. It framed the conflict as righteous crusaders versus pure evil. These accusations helped justify holy wars, military campaigns against the Norse. They made forced conversions seem necessary, even benevolent. They provided moral cover for destroying pagan shrines and traditions.
So this Christian propaganda definitely fueled those negative stereotypes about Vikings, the mindless, bloodthirsty, savage image.
Undoubtedly. It contributed significantly to stereotypes that linger even today. And it makes finding the historical truth so much harder for us now, because we're digging through layers of bias, exaggeration, deliberate misrepresentation.
You constantly have to ask, who wrote this and why? What did they gain by painting their enemies this way?
Exactly. The stories we tell about others, especially enemies, are rarely objective.
Which is why digging into the context like this is so vital. It's not just learning facts, but understanding how those facts were created. The biases baked in makes you a better critical thinker about history.
It really does. So let's try and tie these two threads together now, because it's a profound contrast, isn't it?
Yeah, completely different stories.
On one hand, the Magdalenian experience, clear, strong archaeological and genetic evidence. It points to a culturally driven funerary ritual, widespread, deliberate eating of the dead as part of their society, their chosen way.
Okay, clear ritual. Then the Vikings.
Viking Age claims, fragmented, ambiguous sources, crucially, lacking strong archaeological confirmation for any widespread practice, if it happened. Almost certainly extreme, isolated survival scenarios. And the narrative around it heavily influenced, maybe even created, by external propaganda designed to demonize them.
It's fascinating how the same word, cannibalism, can mean such radically different things depending on context and motive.
Exactly. For the Magdalenians, it seems it might have been a profound act, maybe honoring the dead, incorporating them part of their cultural identity. For the Vikings, if it happened at all, it was a grim last resort against their norms and largely a weapon used by their enemies. One word, vast spectrum of meaning and behavior.
This whole deep dive, it just reveals the incredible range of human behavior, doesn't it? Cultural practices across time. It forces you to confront that what seems utterly taboo, unthinkable to us now, might have been a deep ritual elsewhere or a horrifying necessity somewhere else entirely.
It really underscores the importance of critical thinking in history, moving beyond those simple, sensational stories, looking at the whole picture, all the evidence, the context.
And that's why this matters to you, listening now. Understanding these different forms of cannibalism isn't just about disturbing historical footnotes.
Right. It sheds light on human adaptability, the incredible ways humans have responded to their environment, their beliefs, their dire circumstances. It shows the amazing power of cultural norms to shape even fundamental behaviors, how we treat our dead, how we survive, how we tell stories.
And it highlights the extraordinary lengths people and societies might go to under extreme pressure, pushing the boundaries of experience.
It also, crucially, hammers home the importance of scrutinizing historical narratives. Understanding bias, who wrote this, why. Appreciating how archaeology, genetics, texts all have to work together critically to rebuild the past. You can't just take an ancient writer's word for it, especially if they had an axe to grind.
Definitely makes you a more discerning consumer of information, not just about history, but about everything, really.
So we've journeyed from deep prehistory, the Magdalenians practicing what looks like routine funerary cannibalism, part of their culture,
to the Viking Age.
Yeah.
Where claims were more likely about desperate survival in rare cases and heavily distorted by the propaganda of their enemies.
It's a stark contrast, and it leaves us with a really profound question, I think.
Yeah.
What does it truly tell us about ourselves, about the sheer range of human behavior, that such a fundamental taboo eating human flesh can show up in so many different ways across history, from solemn ritual to desperate act, even used as a weapon of propaganda?
How much of history even the unthinkable parts, is shaped by cultural context, by pressures, and maybe most of all, by the stories we tell or are told about other people.
It's a question that really challenges us to always approach history, and maybe all information, with deep curiosity and a really discerning eye.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into, well, the complex fabric of human experience. We hope it gave you something truly compelling to think about.